Hi everyone, Dr. Dan Lawrence here, Associate Professor of Writing at the University of Wisconsin-Superior, or at least right in this moment, in this transient temporal time. That is part of my identity. What is this video? This video is going to be a kind of nutshell of the history of rhetoric and then why that's a limited, problematic view, and how we can expand that a little bit. So I'll try to be a bit brief here, and you'll have to excuse me. It's a little bit early here at this moment that I'm recording, and I've never been much of a morning person, so I don't know why I'm doing this right now. I felt really compelled. A couple of reasons. Well, I've been teaching this Introduction to Rhetoric course for quite a few years now, 5 or 6 years, and I'm going to continue teaching it, and I'm always building and expanding upon the ideas there and always introducing new concepts. And the text I always go to is Williams, excuse me, Williams's Introduction to Classical Rhetoric, and it's a bit it's limited, right? So there's reasons why I use this textbook. It has a wide selection of primary readings from classical rhetoric. So you get your Plato, you get your Gorgias, you have your Cicero, your Quintillion, you even have Horace and Hedwana, Sappho, Aristotle. I mean, all the, right, we're really, and then Williams's introductory essays are not fun to read, but it's a really dense academic style that I sort of personally abhor. But the level of granularity and detail, and also the sweeping arc, it's a really hard thing to do. So you'll see as I kind of stumble through this video, rhetorical history, you have to cover 5,000 years of human experience to make sense of it. It's one of the oldest human disciplines. It's one of our most ancient arts, the art of rhetoric. So Williams does do a lot right, and there are reasons why I continue to use that textbook that I hope you will see as you go through the course or study rhetoric. There's reasons, there's really compelling reasons why we use this textbook. In fact, the content of this video, I'm going to travel through many of the same areas that Williams is going to travel through. But then he misses a lot too. Do we really start rhetoric with the ancient Greeks? George Kennedy does, one of the most, excuse me again, one of the most important, salient rhetorical scholars from the 20th century. Kennedy writes a new history of classical rhetoric, kind of revises our understanding. And Kennedy was a scholar of classics, so kind of one of these real, reading the ancient Greek, retranslating. So it has a profound understanding of some of these texts and resets them for us. And that's, Kennedy, here we go, we're jumping in already. George Kennedy, he'll explain what he thinks of the origin of rhetoric as this need for survival. So you have a social, cultural, political, economic situation in ancient Athens where if you want to defend yourself in a court of law, Kennedy says you must be a really great speaker, right? It's rhetoric arises, that is, the study of persuasion arises out of this survival necessity. And so then an economy rises up around teaching people how to be great speakers. There's the sophists. Then you have the philosophers who react against the sophists because they're saying that the sophists are only teaching people how to be sneakily, trickily persuasive without being able to argue for the right reasons, being ethical speakers, being meaningful communicators, being philosophical in their approach to language. Now, Kennedy is not completely accurate. No scholar is completely accurate in their work. We're always building, right? We're always building on the work of others and building up through time. Kennedy is not entirely accurate about this. my understanding after investigating a bit into the history of legal studies, it seems that there's records of aristocratic, higher class, upper class ancient Athenians hiring representation for the courts, or there are other types of monetary exchanges going on. So it's not fully, and that's not my area of expertise either, is the history of legal representation. That's a really niche kind of subfield of a subfield. But Kennedy doesn't seem entirely accurate about this, and for other reasons too, which is that Kennedy here is specifically talking about meta rhetoric, which is the study of persuasion. So it's true that ancient Greeks do develop a rich culture and field of study and a discipline around rhetoric in a way that other cultures hadn't. But that doesn't mean that other peoples hadn't been thinking about rhetoric for thousands of years. And so that's why Williams includes Enheduanna in this anthology. That's why I continue to teach Enheduanna, because look, 2,000 years even before the ancient Greeks, you have Enheduanna using rhetorical techniques in her poetry. Things like allusion, anaphora. Now, some of that comes to us through the translation from the cuneiform or cuneiform. All right, that's your wedge in the clay tablets, one of the earliest forms of writing, maybe the first forms of writing. And Enheduanna places us pretty close to those first archaeological records of writing. The very first records we have of writing seem to be things like business transactions. So they're like receipts for payment, 10 bushels of wheat for 20 barrels of beer, and I'll pay you such and such a thing. And then that was with the cuneiform, with the stone wedge, that was placed into the tablet, and then that was baked, and then that survives. And I love the materiality of that too. That's part of the reason why we still have some of these very, very ancient scripts, is because they were carved into walls, or they were wedged into tablets that harden with heat, harden over time. They get stronger even materially, physically over time, or even during catastrophes. So during the siege of a city, and you can imagine the kind of almost apocalyptic way of life thousands of years ago, where your city is always at risk of being overrun by the Romans or any other group of people setting fire to your city. And so some of these tablets survive because of their material properties, much more than think of all that was lost in the burning of the Library of Alexandria. By comparison, by contrast, a sheepskin papyri are going to burn up relatively easily, and so we lose a lot of things over time too. So that's the limitation of Kennedy's initial thoughts, right? So rhetoric does not just belong to the ancient Greeks. We actually have, and you'll see this too when we start looking into comparative rhetoric, we have some of these ancient wisdom books from the ancient Egyptians. We have very sophisticated poetry from from Enheduanna onward, using specific techniques for specific purposes. And then we also have this broader evolutionary biological, certainly before the technology of writing was created by humans, humans are still persuasive. Because you go back even further, you have maybe like 10,000 years, 12,000 years of what we call a kind of civilized agricultural society, gatherings of people, building towns and cities and governments, and doing the thing that we're doing now, having these small nation states and then building those up. Certainly they were being rhetorical. And then even more recently in the scholarship, we're starting to think about non-human communication and non-human rhetoric in the way that, animals try to attempt to persuade each other. So Kennedy revises some of his theories in this book on comparative rhetoric, and says that, well, it actually seems that rhetoric is a property of the conservation of, or it's a, rather, rhetoric is a result of the property of the conservation of energy. So imagine two animals who are competing, we'll say elk, not that I know a whole lot about elk, but with these kind of massive uh, antlers, and they're competing for territory or for a spouse or what have you, and they're locking antlers and they're butting heads and banging into each other. That's dangerous, and you could potentially die from doing that. And so Kennedy speculates that animals have found ways to conserve their energy, conserve their life, and be rhetorical instead. And so that's why you have something like a bowerbird that does these elaborate dances and builds structures out of twigs to try to attract a mate. It's a property of conservation of energy, rather than merely just attacking. Right, that would be the more dangerous, less evolutionary, biologically sound method of taking the mate, as the male birds could attack each other or what have you. Rather, the bowerbird builds these elaborate structures and does these funny dances that you would see on the kind of David Attenborough nature documentary as a principle of the conservation of energy. Now, it's hard to say then, is like the bird conscious of itself doing this, and that's a complicated question and probably not, but there's a lot we could go into there. So right, rhetoric is something you do. Rhetoric is something that creatures do, and that extends. And again, I'm not sure that Kennedy has that perfectly accurately. I'm not sure that Kennedy's idea that it's a conservation of energy is perfectly right, but it does seem that there's right, animals do communicate, and you have a history of humans pre-writing, and you have cognitive revolution as far back as 40, 50,000 years ago. And so people were certainly persuading and even telling stories and right making music and doing all kinds of complex communicative things and arts, right? So you really do have you have like Chauvet cave painting 40, 50,000 years ago. You have the first bone flutes and clay ocarinas, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago. Again, that's not my specific field of study, is early human records, archaeology, anthropology, but certainly it's dated somewhere in that 40, 50,000 years ago, quite far back. And then you have all the, preceding that as well. Certainly you have the organization of different tribes, and you have humans crafting some of their first tools and organizing their ways of life and communicating. And that's rhetoric, right? It's persuading one another. So there's a deep, long history there. Okay, but now the focus of the class looks at this canonical understanding of when does meta-rhetoric develop? When do humans first become especially aware of their capacity to persuade, and when do they start writing about it and building a discipline around it? That's where it gets particularly interesting for scholars. We have this meta-reflection on our ability to communicate and to persuade, and that is the field of rhetoric. Rhetoric is both doing, right? It's both the art of persuading, the art of building artful communication, but it's also the study of people doing it. It's also the study of persuasion, the study of persuasion, if that makes sense. I hope it does. Kennedy places that origin at that economic necessity, that survival necessity. People need to defend themselves in the court of law. That seems to be historically more or less accurate, right? Maybe not perfectly accurate. But then you have the sophists emerge, who are teachers for hire. Now, someone like Gorgias, who we actually read, has some really elegant, surviving texts like the Encomium of Helen. So it's hard to take Plato entirely seriously in his critique of the sophists, because some of the sophists were great thinkers, great speakers. They were clearly aware of some of the ethical problems of language. Gorgias is absolutely aware of some of the ethical issues of language. He says speech is like a drug. Gorgias likens the effects of language over the mind to the effects of drugs over the body. That is, that speech and language can bewitch you. It can change your way of perceiving reality. It can change your way of perceiving the world. So you best be aware of that. That's Gorgias. That's before Plato. I mean, Gorgias is writing this, and he's aware of this. So it's hard to take Plato entirely seriously in his critique of the sophists because some of them were nuanced thinkers. Nonetheless, Plato builds a really strong case in his various dialogues, especially the one we'll focus on in Phaedrus. This is where Plato says, you must first be a great thinker. You must first analyze your subject and roll it around and look at it from every angle, and only then can you be a rhetorician. What harvest of rhetoric will you have? If you perceive the donkey to be a horse. I've butchered that, but you'll find that in the second half of Phaedrus, something very similar to this. If you perceive reality incorrectly and inaccurately, and you don't fully think about your subject, and then you go on and speak about it, what a mess you'll make. And in contemporary terms, we think of this of like misinformation and disinformation. So Plato is reacting against the sophists because Plato believes that language needs an ethics. He thinks that rhetoric needs an ethics, and that rhetoric needs philosophy. Those are the two principal arts of human experience. The ancient Greeks had a very strong oral culture, a very strong oral tradition. They highly valued speeches. You'll see in Phaedrus that what was Phaedrus doing the morning that he meets Socrates before he encounters Socrates? He was giving speeches with his buddies. It was as entertainment. It's hard to imagine. Maybe we don't now typically sit around and give speeches to one another. It's not a form of entertainment. We tell stories, though, so you can see how that oral tradition echoes throughout time. So that's Plato's reaction: is you must have a kind of ethics. You must have philosophy if you're going to teach the organization of speech. Because there are these early handbooks about how to organize a speech in a persuasive manner, and how should you structure it, and what are some of the tricks you can use to be especially persuasive. Plato doesn't really like that. In this weird way, Aristotle returns to that almost heuristic style, but it's as a scientist. Aristotle wants to truly understand what are the mechanisms of rhetoric. And that's why he breaks, you have like the epideiectic, and he breaks down the deliberative, the judicial, breaking down speech into different types. That's why he gives us the classic ethos, pathos, logos, the artistic proofs that you'll see in Aristotle. Aristotle is a scientist, right? He's really well known for being the kind of father of all scientific disciplines, which is both true and not true. But zoology, biology, he wrote extensively about so many different topics that he, in a sense, founded these very disciplines that we still have with us today. And in a sense, there's your two. Plato and Aristotle represent the two branches of academic study that still exist, which is the humanities and the sciences. It's a gross overgeneralization and reduction, but it roughly maps onto history and what they wrote about. So Plato as the representation of the arts, of the humanities, of looking for the locus of truth in something ethereal and beyond and metaphysical. And then Aristotle being, looking down at the world with the magnifying glass and trying to examine the very ground we walk on and what we do. It's not precisely that division between their work. In fact, there's a lot of overlap between their work. Both Plato and Aristotle study rhetoric, and they're both right. But it's a kind of neat way of thinking about the echoes of their work throughout history. From Aristotle, then, we move into the ancient Romans. And what do the ancient Romans do? They strive to be like, they strive to follow the model of Plato and Aristotle, but they never quite succeed at it. There is no great Roman philosopher. There is Cicero, there is Quintillion, there is Horace the poet. They do produce, you have Virgil, and you have there's some literary merit to what the Romans do, but it's this kind of imperial machinery. It's this great, it's this massive, I don't want to say great, I'm not making a value judgment. It's machinery, it's complex, it's a complex empire with all these different locations and logistics and populations and warfare going on. And they're great borrowers. The ancient Romans borrow from the ancient Greeks, and they borrow especially from Aristotle methodologically, but they also attempt to borrow from Plato. Cicero goes on in the Aristotelian tradition, that is, following Aristotle, in creating some framework. So that's where you have the 5 canons of rhetoric from Cicero. You have something like invention, 5 canons that Cicero breaks it down into. Moving on, you have Quintillion, who studies education. Quintillion's really interested in how do you teach rhetoric to people? How do you teach people to be persuasive? Can you even? This is an important question for Quintillion. Can you even teach someone to be persuasive? Can you, in a sense, endow them with the gift of gab? Can you actually help someone, or is it a kind of inherent, innate property that people seem to have, and then you can just sort of chisel away at it? It's really still an educational, philosophical question that we struggle with. To what extent can you mold and develop a skill set? I will never be a great ice skater, right? It's not in my nature. Maybe I could be. Maybe if I really went for it. It's not something that interests me, though. So this Quintillion is wrestling with this deterministic problem. It's like how much of a person's ability as a writer and speaker is innate, and how much of it can be taught and can be chiseled and perfected and worked upon. And he's a practicing. I mean, he's really an active teacher, Quintillion, right? He has all these students, and he's working with them and rigorously training them to be great rhetoricians in the service of the Roman Empire, in the service of the empire. So the Romans are thinking about more of the practical applications of rhetoric. They're thinking about how can we train great speakers to be great politicians, to be cogs in the wheel of the Roman machinery, of the Roman Empire, and serve their country and be great Romans. And you can actually, I think that you can palpably sense the extent of the propaganda and indoctrination in a writer like Cicero and Quintillion. They've consumed the Roman Kool-Aid. They're very nationalistic in an almost terrifying way. Finally, then, I'm being quite lengthy here, but I'm trying to really cover like an entire history of rhetoric for you to help you wrap your brain around it. Finally, where Williams leaves off is Augustine. He places St. Augustine of Hippo at the end of the classical period, because Augustine does wrestle with rhetoric, but it's showing Augustine is representative of this broader shift toward the revolution of Christianity that's historically, socially moving throughout the ancient world, and much is changing. So you have Augustine taking the locus of truth and placing it in God, and almost a return to Plato, because Plato is a metaphysician. Plato says, truth is somewhere out there with the ideal forms, somewhere in the colorless place beyond the universe. Our soul came into contact with perfect forms somewhere. Augustine is saying, if you want truth in this world, in this universe, look to God, and that is where you'll find truth. Is shifting the focus, shifting the locus of truth in his writing. And also, there's more to it than that. This deeply personal, autobiographical, first-person style of writing is quite unique and quite compelling. and that shapes a lot of literary trajectory. And so we have a lot to owe to Augustine. It's not just that he's representative of the first paradigm shift of the Christian writers, it's also that he's autobiographical, self reflective. I mean, what looks more like Shakespeare, Augustine or Plato? I think Augustine, right? I think Augustine, even though, we have 1,000 years from Augustine to Shakespeare, Augustine kind of opens up the human flower, if that makes sense, opens up the psyche, the various dimensions of the struggles, the internal struggles that all humans experience. We don't, not till Shakespeare do you get the full kind of portrayal and developmental depictions of complex human nature. But nonetheless, Augustine is there sketching it out about himself, and of course Augustine has read Plato and Aristotle, just like everyone has, right? And you should too. Augustine is thinking about these deep internal psychological struggles because Plato did too, and he's drawing on that rich tradition. Plato always wrote in the form of the dialogue, though, never in that first person investigative, autobiographical, or self narrative, anecdotal, internal, introspective engagement like Augustine does. But nonetheless, Plato is a kind of proto psychologist thinking about human nature and all the internal fires of the human mind. Augustine around, Williams places Augustine at the end of the classical period. And then you have your kind of dark ages, right? Scholarship, the academic tradition. There's a little bit of a empty spot on the radar there as Europe and the West falls into quite a bit of turmoil. And again, I'm so now I'm not in any way a medieval scholar. So some of my gaps there, right? But even when I think about like a timeline of significant literary, scholarly, philosophical achievements, we put Beowulf around maybe 900 CE. I'm being really broad in my, memory here, but like from Augustine 400 CE to, all right, we have some epic poetry 500 years later that isn't even, that's drawing from a different tradition, right? Drawing from a different tradition than the ancient Grecian philosophical tradition. Eventually, you get the Renaissance, though, right? And so this is Williams says, here's what happens, and this seems to be historically accurate: as the walls of Constantinople fall, that is the very end of the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. And all those scholars in the city of Constantinople have manuscripts of Aristotle and Plato and some of the Roman thinkers, and they bring them into Europe. This spurs on a new kind of intellectual revolution, and it's not long after you get the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment. You have this return to Aristotle, and then you have the building of the sciences, humanities, refresh, essentially, moving from that, and it's also technological, right? Moving from, when you think about, like, okay, people living in walled cities and castles attacking each other for hundreds and hundreds of years. The technological advancement of the large cannon shows that any wall can be broken. The walls of Constantinople fall, and it basically marks the end of the walled city-state because humans can no longer trust that their walls will keep others out. And so there's a flourishing of political activity, and suddenly you have to negotiate with others, and you need diplomacy. And so you have the development of really complex and interesting nation states, and you have the development of art and philosophy and technology and sciences and all these sort of things going on. And that really roughly brings us to today. What the contemporary rhetorical scholarship looks like: a lot of different things. We have different methods for conducting rhetorical analysis. Some rhetorical scholars think about digital rhetoric, about how to be persuasive in online spaces and what that looks like. Some contemporary rhetorical scholars, they look at They look at non-discursive rhetoric. They think about the ways that humans communicate that are not text-based. There are all these different branches of rhetorical theory and rhetorical thought. Rhetorical scholars continue to think about the functioning of human communication. I need to stop because this is like half an hour long now. I'm so sorry. But I wanted to, isn't this great what we did though? Because we went as far back as 50,000 years ago and more or less brought us up to the present day. And it's through these thinkers and through these texts. I mean, early deception and propaganda and persuasion, we have hints of that as far back as our cave paintings and first musical instruments, and probably people were trying to persuade others even further back than that, because there's good documentation about animal communication. And then you have Enheduanna and some of the first poets and writers who attached their names to texts. That was about that's 2200, 400 BCE. And then 2,000 years after Enheduanna, you come to the ancient Greeks, who are the first meta-rhetoricians. That's why we really focus on the ancient Greeks. They're seemingly the first culture who stop and study rhetoric. The ancient Greeks are not the first culture who do rhetoric, because rhetoric is everywhere. Rhetoric is in every military speech. Rhetoric is in your daily communications. Rhetoric is our music, it's our persuasion, it's our conversation. So people were doing rhetoric for thousands of years before the ancient Greeks, but the ancient Greeks are the first to stop and try to make a study of it. Other than, you do have ancient Egyptian wisdom books and some other meta-rhetorical things going on, but the ancient Greeks really make a big deal out of it and begin our field of study of rhetoric. That's why we start there. And that is principally this relationship between Plato reacting against the sophists, the teachers for hire. Plato then says, hey, what about ethics? What about philosophy? You can't just teach people to be persuasive speakers without teaching them to be philosophers, without teaching them about how to think. First, you have to think before you speak. We still have that as a maxim, a kind of common piece of wisdom in our daily lives. You have to think before you speak. You have to assess your subject. And then Aristotle builds on Plato. Plato was drawing from Socrates. The ancient Romans draw from Aristotle and Plato. Augustine marks the cap of the classical period, because then we have these we have a loss of scholarly activity through this tumultuous period of the Dark Ages, and we have the rise of Christianity, which is paradigmatically replaces philosophy. It's something else. It's a theology becomes the central way of viewing the world for a long time. In many ways, we still have that rippling throughout, especially in the U.S. That's still very prevalent, right? As a way of viewing the world, as a way of living our lives, as a way of analyzing the universe and reality. Theology is still a principal methodological approach to that in many people's lives. Finally, though, the Eastern Roman Empire finally falls in, I forget the exact year, it's 1400s. So, my goodness, right? Ancient Rome lasts for a really long time, thousands of years, literally. Finally, Constantinople falls, and there's a return to the ancient Greeks, and rhetoric comes back, and philosophy comes back, and science and art kind of find their way throughout Europe. And then you have scientific revolution, industrial revolution. Now we live in this kind of information age, technological revolution. And, I think we should feel quite grateful that we still have this ancient wisdom to draw upon to help us understand the world that we live in. Rhetoric is one of the oldest arts of humanity. It's one of our oldest art forms. It's one of our most important art forms, because we need to think about what we do and what we say in the world. And in that sense, it's a kind of framework for viewing reality. I've got to stop now. It's a pleasure speaking with you, and I could go on and on, but this is, in a nutshell, human history through the lens of rhetoric, or the history of rhetoric in a nutshell. I hope this is helpful as you go throughout your life or this class. Take care.